Welcome to the Significant Conversation series, this one on mis and disinformation in academic medicine. And I'm going to give a few opening comments, if I could, and ask, how is it that our scientific, social, political, medical, religious perspectives lead us to a variety of ways for us to preserve beliefs, often through an exaggerated interpretation of objective information, and that we have such a tendency for political commentary and commingling of historical, biological, and medical facts, at least as we remember them. Can we and should we separate our perspective and beliefs when we are approaching a scientific discovery and making a medical decision? Perhaps we're all wired to do so. And therefore, we need constant reminders that when we discuss facts and perspectives, we do so with the best interest of having an open mind in order to listen and adjust our assumptions and assimilation of data, hypotheses, and conclusions. And pretty often, our audience matters. And if we have had anything happen in the last 4 years, it's realize how provocative a huge deluge of information can be. And now that chat AI is about to enter the world, it will really transform this conversation in a way that I don't think any of us really understand. So I'm delighted as dean of the school to sort of have this conversation take place and help us work through some of the obvious challenges. I should probably define, I had one of our staff look up and remind me that misinformation is defined as false or misleading information, and disinformation is that which we deliberately create as false or misleading. We certainly have seen that with the COVID pandemic and issues related to masking and vaccines, et cetera. But that was just a microcosm of the environment that we're in. I don't think there was anything particularly special about that, but it fed the discontent, confusion, and frankly, harm to public health. So if we in the medical community are curators of facts as clinicians and scientists, how do we best manage, build, test, and query hypotheses? It's not a simple task. And back to the AI chat this evening, I think. I read it last weekend. The New England Journal will publish 2 articles on medicine and artificial intelligence and the chatbot world. Both are actually pretty illuminating, so I hope you will read them. And both are careful to comment on the value of somebody writing your medical history, somebody writing your summary article, and pointing out the complexity that very often the information flow can't tell what's informed and truthful from what isn't, just based on where it is in the literature. And we're complex in our conversation around academic freedom, and sometimes we confuse academic freedom with the need to sort of keep in mind the essence of scholarship and scientific progress. I mean, you can just imagine a conversation, I'm sure that article will be written soon, about how we should think of chat AI as a space of academic freedom. How could let them say what they need to because it's academic freedom. So academic freedom is actually much more constrained. It's the freedom to champion a variety of ideas and to defend them and think about them and make sure that we're on the right track. It's not really you can say anything you want without fear of somebody conflicting with you on a topic. So understanding these boundaries, I think, is what we want to accomplish. So I'm an observer, and luckily we have a number of experts. So I'm going to turn the podium in a second over to Dr. Mark Luzio, who is the Susan E. Watson Professor and Chair of the Department of Bioethics and the Director of the Center for Bioethics at Metro Health. And he will bring with him, has brought with him, Dr. Josh Wilt, Senior Research Associate and Social psychology instructor in the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Wilt will address individual perspectives and how they can influence our perceptions and recall. Dr. Eric Lamb is the faculty lead of the humanities pathway of the medical school, and he gets to navigate with our medical students some of these significant conversations. He's the Carl Azoff MD, MBA, JD, designated professor of medical humanities. And Dr. Julie, got it, thank you. And Julie Washington is here as a medical technology reporter for the Plain Dealer. So probably actually deals with the public face of this much more than we can imagine, and will speak on the role of the press in our current media and information environment. And Dr. Usha Seifel is an infectious disease physician, associate professor at the Louis Stokes Cleveland VA, and she'll talk to us about misinformation and disinformation in that all-important space of infectious diseases and everything that we've all experienced with most any vaccine or other that you can imagine. And rounding out is Dr. Russell Bedsole, clinical assistant professor at the Cleveland Clinic Lunar College of Medicine, expert in the role of educators in training healthcare professionals and our approach to public communication. So I'm looking forward to their comments and questions and answers that we'll have, and provocative discussion. And when it's time to break, Mark will let us know. We'll go out and have a bite and keep talking. Carry on.
Thank you, Dean Gerson. Much appreciated. And we've got a good group here. And those of you who've come to the last of several of these, I mean, this is our fourth. So, the focus here is conversation. So we'll be short in our remarks, hopefully 5-ish minutes or so, but and then open up and we'll see the direction it takes, right? But the focus really here is, yes, conversation, but about disinformation, misinformation. And so I've been asked to talk a little bit about what this means, and then, our inclinations as humans to go down these holes, right? Well, today, my son sent me a barrage of texts from Pitt. He's at the University of Pittsburgh, and they were on lockdown because across Pennsylvania, he didn't know it at the time, there were basically robocalls of threats to schools for shooters, and he thought there was an active shooter, 6 injured at Pittsburgh Central Catholic, right next to where his dorm is. And so Pitt went on lockdown, and they were on lockdown for a few hours. It turned out to be a hoax. And right there, you can see there's misinformation. They were on lockdown. Active shooter. Nope, wasn't actually an active shooter. 6 people shot. Nope, not really. But that's what we thought, right? And then there's disinformation. Whoever was behind the robocalls obviously was going for disinformation, right? And it terrified people. And it wasn't an irrational response in the environment in which we find ourselves, right, all these years with school shootings and mass shootings. We have over 100 since the start of the year, which not of school, but of mass shootings. And it's stunning. But there's also a middle ground, right? There's the intent to mislead. There's misleading or false, right? Intent to purvey misleading and false. And there's also I don't care because I get clicks and I can sell advertising and so forth. And I don't care also matters. And in looking at misinformation websites during the pandemic, there were at least 630. A good number of them were probably the I don't care type. But it turns out that when something is inflammatory and contrary and especially scary, we humans are particularly sensitive to it, 4 to 5 times more so than, say, good news, right? And we're more prone to share it, and other people are more prone to share it. And even without a bad intention, it moves like wildfire. And that matters mightily. It matters especially so when we are inclined to also appreciate that we get clicks. So if any of you have looked at Max Fisher's The Chaos Machine, his investigative look at what happened with Facebook pre and during the pandemic, but other times as well. It turns out that we humans, when we get lots of likes and clicks, even if it's something we didn't particularly care for and didn't maybe even want to share all that much, we start sharing more of that stuff and more of it and more of it, and we all do it. So that's a problem, right? Chaos machine. The third point I wanted to talk about is that, why do we fall for it? Well, it's partly what we're like, so we're susceptible. But there are other features of what we're like. We use heuristics to get through life. Most of us, in fact, I'll say none of us are able to, thoroughly vet whatever is in front of us, right? So how do we navigate life? And this is true for all of us. We navigate partly by taking our cues from our groups, our in-groups. Oh, they did a nice job for you painting, Dean Gerson. So, oh, great, good to hear, right? And when our groups can easily and quickly circulate information, disinformation, misinformation, we're really in trouble. And this is what we do. And it's not that new. Human nature's not new, right? But the mechanism of social media is really new, and it matters. So Jonathan Sadowski, at an earlier one of these conversations, told us that people during the Spanish flu pandemic, so-called, they lined up in terms of masking or not, and conspiracies about where it came from and not, and so on, basically by what their leaders said. Your tribe, your group, we started with tribalism, right? And our challenges that it poses for us, even if, at a certain time in human history and even features of it now may have been necessary evils. Anyway, one of the antidotes I want to suggest before I hand things over to our group is it actually comes out of bioethics and medical humanities. We need to be open to many lenses, to lots of different perspectives, because for us, our perspective is necessarily one and only one. And the more open you are to the multiple perspectives, the less susceptible, presumably, you will be to the disinformation, the disinformed point of view, or the misinformed point of view. We'll always be susceptible. We're just hoping for a little less susceptibility. Okay, so I want to turn things over to Dr. Josh Wilt, who's going to tell us a bit about how individual perspectives can impact how we interpret and recall information coming out of social psychology, which I find to be fascinating and critically important at this moment in time. So turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. It's great to be here and participate in these conversations, and great to see all of you here as well. I will be talking about some of the psychological factors that make people more or less prone to misinformation and disinformation from a social psychological perspective, but also from a personality and individual differences perspective as well. As a personality psychologist and social psychologist, I tend to see different psychological problems in terms of how they relate to individual differences in how people think, how people feel, how people want or desire, or individual differences in motivation, and how those factors affect what people actually end up doing. So it's easy to see, I think, as a personality psychologist, or just in general, that people differ from each other. I'll be talking about some of these individual differences, but also the fact that people differ in the way that they think, in the way they feel, and what they want and desire. It also means that the objective world, the outside world, actually appears differently two different people, even though we kind of see the same environments. We objectively have interactions that we can say like certain facts occurred in those interactions. Because of people's individual differences in their personality and in their psychology, actually can interpret and remember that information quite differently. So I'll be talking about some of these individual differences that are pertinent across cognitive factors, motivational factors, and then affective or feeling or emotional factors as well. So the cognitive factor that I want to touch on, and I'll touch on each of these kind of just briefly to give you an introduction to these concepts, but I'll be talking about schemas, which is kind of a jargony term, which means the way that people organize knowledge in a way such to guide their behaviors. You can think about a schema as kind of an informal model or script. And people have schemas about many things. They have them about themselves. They have them about other people. Say if you have a schema about another person as being friendly and trustworthy and reliable, you might, share information with them. You may go to them for assistance with something. If you have a different schema about them, that could guide your behavior in other ways. You have schemas for events. You kind of know how an event like this is going to evolve over the course of the evening, and you kind of will adjust your behavior accordingly. You can also have schemas a little bit more kind of a little bit more complex schemas about other entities that might be more relevant to misinformation and disinformation, such as the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry, the medical community, and governments. For instance, if you have the schema that the pharmaceutical industry has undue influence on governments and on the medical community, you may be more prone to think that there might be something nefarious going on with the, for example, with the production and distribution of vaccines, and then potentially that misleading information could come out of that relationship. That would be just one example of a schema. So think about what happens when you receive information that's either consistent or inconsistent with your schematic understanding of events. Typically, we interpret information that's consistent with our schemas as being actual, factual, and true information, and you tend to kind of readily absorb that information, whereas information that's inconsistent with schemas, you kind of disregard that. And even if it is backed up by logical reasoning and facts and findings, it tends to be harder to incorporate into how we think about things. So I'll move on because I don't have much time to go into each of these concepts in much detail, but I'll move on from these schemas, which are sort of cold cognitive ways of viewing the world, to go on to something that in psychology we call motivated cognition or attitudes, which tends to be maybe conceptualized as a little bit warmer or emotionally tinged way of viewing the world. So we'll talk about attitudes in general. Attitudes also affect the way that people can interpret and remember information. We have some studies going on right now about attitudes that could be relevant to information about vaccines, for instance. We are assessing people's attitudes about science in general, about scientists, about vaccines in general, whether they have positive or negative views of those different entities. And think about how information is going to be interpreted based on your general attitude toward those different entities. If you have news coming out that's it could be misinformation about potentially vaccines causing adverse side effects, and you have a more negative view toward those communities, you may be more readily to interpret that as true, even if it is misinformation. And also, attitudes can affect the way people remember information and not just interpret information. There's a really interesting study showing that people that have, I think the example that we give when we're talking about attitudes that's kind of too hard to shy away from is in politics. People have very strong attitudes, typically toward positive or negative toward the political, like they're positive toward the political group they identify with, and more negative toward the one that they don't, and increasingly so in our more polarized society. If people that identify more strongly with as Republican see doctored photographs of former President Obama interacting with Iranian political leaders, they're actually more likely to remember that as actually having occurred and being true. But the same is true for people who align more with Democratic political party. If they see pictures of former President Trump interacting with, doctored photos, this didn't happen. If they see those photos of former President Trump interacting with Iranian political leaders, they will actually think and remember that as having actually happened. So not only can schemas affect the way people interpret information, but attitudes can affect the way that people interpret and remember information. Now, I do have just a little bit of time to go into this negativity bias, which was alluded to earlier, and it refers to this idea that people are kind of more keyed into, and kind of their attention is captured more by negative information than positive information. The typical example that people use to describe this is that people are kind of more interested in negative news than positive news. And empirical studies show that even physiological reactions are more robust and more extreme toward negative news across countries than more positive news. Now, another interesting thing about this negativity bias is that people are not only more keyed into negative things, but they actually interpret negative information as more true than positive information. And it seems to be due to that when you receive negative information, you tend to elaborate on that more. Whereas if you receive positive information, you think, oh, things are going okay. I don't really have to concern myself with this too much. When negative information comes in, you tend to elaborate about it, think about it. And in so doing, come up with more reasons to support why that negative information might be true. Now think about how all of this kind of comes together. These affective, motivational, and cognitive factors influence the way that people might interpret information. Say they come across misinformation about a potentially very extreme, severe adverse reaction to a vaccine. If they have a schema that suggests that pharmaceutical companies have undue influence on media and on the medical community, if they have political attitudes that are more right-leaning, if they're seeing this extreme negative information, that's going to create kind of a constellation of factors that might lead them to really believe that misinformation and then make it very difficult to persuade them otherwise. So just wanted to talk a little bit about some of these psychological factors that might contribute to predispositions to believe misinformation and disinformation.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Very helpful. So next among our group is Dr. Erin Lamb, who is in our department in bioethics, and one of her areas of expertise is narrative. And we asked her to address a little bit about its power in capturing our imaginations.
Thanks very much, Mark. So as someone with a background in literature, I'm going to come at this a little bit obliquely, which is to think about just how tied up information as a concept is with narrative. The point that I want to add to our discussion today is really quite simple. For most of the American public, narrative is both more persuasive and more accessible than data. And we in academic medicine would do well to recognize this and to think more strategically about how we communicate with the larger public. So in academic medicine, we prize data, particularly quantitative data, to furnish the evidence behind evidence-based medicine. As a lit scholar in a med school, I understand those pressures to translate things that may not seem so data into things that seem more concrete. But for those not trained to have reverence for or specialized skills for interpreting data, then data requires a vehicle to make meaning. To become information for a general public, we contextualize data and turn it into a story of how things work and what things mean. Sometimes we control that process of narrativization of our data. More often we do not. Published data, when it even reaches a broader public, translates into press releases and news stories and sound bites and infographics, and is often lost amid more compelling stories. So this is a problem for two key reasons. First, because compelling stories shape people's beliefs and behaviors. And second, because in an age of increasing internet paywalls for news, the general public becomes less and less likely to see even the translated versions of the data that academic medicine generates. Stories are more likely to come via social media or mass-consumed media like television, where the data may not even enter the picture. So to illustrate the first of these points about how stories shape beliefs and behaviors, particularly in the context of mis and disinformation, I think it might be helpful to look at stories in some of their most compelling forms, television dramas. So an early study by Morgan, Movius, and Cody looked at television dramas that featured plot lines involving organ donation to try to determine what effect, if any, these storylines had on viewers' attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors. And they found that Although the public is obviously conscious of the fact that they are watching fictionalized accounts, these narratives nonetheless exert a very powerful influence. Viewers' responses reflected the contents of the episodes that they'd viewed even months after the original viewing. And this is a problem largely because, and I know that this may shock you, some of the content of those episodes was not particularly accurate. For example, there were shows portraying a black market for selling organs in the U.S., stories of people miraculously recovering after being brain dead, or suggesting that organs will be given to people who are rich and can pull strings. But perhaps more important than this inaccurate knowledge about organ donation is the power that these television narratives had to influence people's behaviors. Namely, in this study, they were looking at whether or not people were willing to be organ donors. The study suggested that the more emotionally involving and absorbing people found a particular television episode, the more likely they were to perceive the episode's content as fact. And here's the positive. If the show happened to encourage organ donation, then the more emotionally involving and absorbing it was, the more likely viewers were to become organ donors. So later studies that are looking at this concept of narrative persuasion speak to this idea of emotional involvement with terms like narrative engagement or narrative transportation. And studies have consistently shown that being swept up in a narrative is a key component of narrative influence. So let's think for a moment about something like vaccines, right? We can tell the story that only 1 or 2 people in a million might experience an adverse reaction to a vaccine. The vast majority of vaccinations happen without event, and the benefits are so clear. Because of vaccines, whole generations don't get sick anymore. That's a good story. But it is a far less compelling story than the one about my cousin, who had a really bad reaction to that vaccine, and he had to be hospitalized. And he's still dealing with all the cardiac and neurological effects of that, and he can't work anymore, and he's trying to fight to get on disability. And he might have to even file for bankruptcy. And if vaccines are so safe, then why does the government have a national vaccine injury compensation program? Huh? Right. Here we have character and action and conflict, right? This is a story. It's reductive, but I hope you take my larger point, which is that data must be narrativized to be meaningful. But the narratives likely to circulate most broadly and most likely to shape our beliefs and behaviors are the most engrossing, compelling ones, which are often furthest from the data. So the second key point is that much of our data is off limits to the general public. Even with our amazing library resources here at CASE, I still have to jump through hoops to get access to some published scholarly articles. But should someone want access to scholarly articles who is not affiliated with an educational institution, they likely cannot. So the data is largely unavailable to the broader public. And moreover, a key part of the problem with the spread of mis- and disinformation is that it's not just the rise, right, of social media where anyone can produce content with relative anonymity and ease, but that our trusted, high-quality news sources are increasingly behind paywalls. And unsurprisingly, studies show that people in the U.S. who pay for news are wealthier and better educated. So the already disadvantaged in society may be stuck with unreliable news sources, which are also often the more compelling narrative presentations of that news as their only sources. So the conclusion here is simply that it would behoove all of us in academic medicine to think more critically about how data is translated into information for the public, and to think more strategically about how we can tell and broadly disseminate better, more compelling stories. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lamb. Really helpful and a window into this issue. So our next speaker will be Julie Washington, who's from the Cleveland Plain Dealer and also Cleveland.com, and is a health reporter and technology reporter. And we're all, I think most of us are familiar with her work, as we, at least I do. I read the Plain Dealer every morning. So, all right. And she's on the front lines of this issue. So.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for braving that cold rain. Or is it that you're just here so you don't have to go in it and you're just waiting here for an hour or so? Either way, we're happy to see you here. I'm so pleased and honored to be part of this panel today. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to CASE for putting this together and and inviting me. As it was said, I've been a health reporter at The Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com for about 5 years, and that I was a health reporter in the trenches during the pandemic. And even now, even though I work with words, I really am at a loss to explain what the experience has been like, except to say that it's been stressful, it's been exhausting, frightening, and frustrating. And the frustrating part is dealing with the misinformation and disinformation. This month, a board meeting of a Sarasota, Florida hospital was the center of an ongoing campaign to challenge its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, fueled by misinformation. Critics accused the hospital of getting kickbacks from drug companies or not providing enough unproven therapies during the pandemic. Some speakers used phrases such as killing fields and biochemical warfare. So the war against disinformation continues, even though this month marks the beginning of the 4th year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the disinformation war is far from over. Since March 2020, more than 6 million people across the globe and nearly 42,000 in Ohio have died from the coronavirus. As a lifelong fan of science fiction literature and films, I especially enjoy books depicting courageous survivors of a worldwide apocalypse trying to make it in the new world they find themselves in. And I especially enjoy the scenes where those characters, gather around a shortwave radio or something to get the latest news to find out what's going on. But when we were faced with a real-life health emergency, people did turn into Wine with DeWine, everyone remember that, for information straight from the source. But they also logged into Facebook, Reddit, and daily newsletters written by some physicians who saw the pandemic as an opportunity to promote their personal brands. These people heard that the vaccine embedded tracking chips in their body, that Bill Gates was behind it all, that the death count was inflated, and that COVID-19 vaccine made people sterile. The one I heard the most was that the vaccine gave you COVID-19, it made you sick, or it gave you an allergic reaction, none of which were true. Very few people had a true allergic reaction. And I found myself answering the emails over and over and over again to try to dispel these myths. The flood of misinformation and disinformation created what the World Health Organization called an infodemic, which it defined as an overload of misleading and untrue information. Of course, the internet and social media contributed to the spread of false, biased, misleading, and erroneous information. This bad information amplified distrust and drowned out good information, which led to increased hospitalizations and deaths and the prolonging of the pandemic. Health reporters, such as myself, with the mainstream media, worked hard to provide honest, clear, and well-sourced information to advance public health policies, but too often it felt as if no one was listening. COVID-19 misinformation also found fertile ground because so many Americans have lost trust in healthcare, either because they lack health insurance, don't have a trusted primary care physician, or have experienced health inequalities based on race, socioeconomic status, or education. And again, I can attest to this because I got dozens of emails that would begin, I take these medications, I have this complicated medical background, what should I do? And I'm thinking, you're asking me? I don't even play a doctor on television. And secondly, I would think, how dumb would I have to be to try to give you medical information in an email? And I would just say, please contact your doctor. And then I realized that these must be people who felt so disconnected from their doctor that they would rather turn to me, a reporter who doesn't really know that much, than reach out to their doctor, which is a sad state of affairs. Once again, I'd like to define misinformation and disinformation because it's here. I know you did it before, but it's here, so I'm going to do it again. Misinformation is false information that is shared, but no harm is meant. Disinformation is when false information is knowingly shared to cause harm. And it's disinformation that undermines trust and amplifies fears. And after listening to that definition again, I'm wondering, there's a really fine line there. I mean, if you're giving out misinformation, but you don't mean harm, it's still harming someone. Someone's still hearing that, you know. And it really doesn't even have to be over social media. I can recall conversations I had with people. Unfortunately, two of them were healthcare workers who debunked the pandemic. One friend of mine who's an engineer has not gotten vaccinated. So it can come just in conversations and face-to-face conversations. You're confronted with these ideas that are misguided. And it's hard to know how to deal with that in a social situation. But when disinformation also floods our social media feeds, it creates an information overload that drowns out facts. People are confronted with more and more information, most of it conflicting, competing for their time and attention. After a while, they give up. And I think we saw this with the pandemic where, I mean, I was hip deep in it, you know, for days and weeks and months, but I think a lot of people were grabbing a headline there, hearing a headline on NPR there. Oh, I heard half of it. Oh, my sister said this. What's really going on with that? They weren't able to just really sit down and consume all of it because there's so much coming at them. Disinformation also can be increasingly well disguised, and it's less apt to be challenged when listeners or readers lack media literacy skills to be able to tell the difference between truth and fiction. In a 2021 survey conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that misinformation about COVID-19 was ubiquitous. 60% of adults said they had heard that the federal government was exaggerating COVID-19 deaths by counting deaths due to other factors. 39% had heard that pregnant women should not get the COVID-19 vaccine, and nearly 20% believed it. 30% had heard that the vaccine had been shown to cause infertility, and they either believed it or they weren't sure if it was true. All this misinformation became a challenge and a burden to individual health, public health, and governments globally. It led to vaccine and mask avoidance and people turning to unproven COVID-19 treatments. And if you want proof, just look at the statistics. As of last week, only 68.3% of Ohioans over age 5 had been vaccinated against COVID-19. And this is after we've had vaccines for 2 years now, 2 or 3 years now. People are just, the appetite's not there for getting vaccinated. And even fewer have received their booster dose. And this vaccine hesitancy is not only with COVID-19 vaccines, it's spreading over to other vaccines. I was interviewing a doctor who said that he's never seen this many parents reluctant to get their children vaccinated on a wide range of things because that's just in the water now. It's just in the air. The Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com and other members of the mainstream media, and for me that's not a pejorative term, worked tirelessly, and we're still working, to provide clear, factual, and science-based information to our readers and listeners. Our goal is to advance public health policies and help control the emergency. The media works to pre-bunk, or debunk false or misleading information, provide readers with truthful and accurate and timely information, explain how the scientific process works, and educate readers about sharing social media content responsibly. Inside the Cleveland.com newsroom, during the pandemic, editors and health reporters have considered the best way to combat misinformation. We had to decide if repeating falsehoods, even to debunk them, was helpful or would only spread the falsehoods further. In the end, we chose to focus on truthful information in a series of Q&A stories that allowed physicians to convey facts about some of these myths, such as women and vaccines and other topics, without specifically repeating the misinformation, just putting out the good information. So we hope that worked. The pandemic is far from over, and the media's responsibility to deliver unbiased facts to fight the information tsunami never ends. We stand ready, as always, for the next pandemic.
Right on the front lines. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Ujja Stiefel, and Dr. Stiefel is an associate professor of infectious at the VA, associate professor at Case, but at the VA she's a infectious disease doc, and of course a pretty interesting field to be in, and specialization coming on the heels. Well, we're still in it, but in a pandemic. So thank you.
So I'm the chief of infectious diseases at the VA, and I will provide a little bit more of a clinician's perspective here. I think the main emphasis of what I want to talk about is trust. I think medical misinformation is not new, but social trust in our society, trust in each other, trust in our institutions is at an all-time low. And I think that makes it very difficult to address medical misinformation. So I'll share a redacted clinical vignette. Of course, we don't have any monoclonal antibodies to treat COVID-19 anymore. They've become ineffective because of the current variants, but they were very effective when they were around, and they became available in 2021. And especially with some of the more morbid variants, they were very effective, about 70 to 80% effective in preventing progression to severe disease or to hospitalization, especially in unvaccinated populations. So like many institutions, we were pretty overwhelmed with COVID in 2020 and 2021. When we first introduced monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of COVID-19 at our VA in mid-2021, they were under an emergency use authorization, so not FDA approved, but FDA authorized. And dissemination of the medications was really under my purview. And for 8 months, I really called all the outpatients throughout our healthcare system who were diagnosed with COVID and who were a candidate for these medications to offer them. And we had a few infusion clinic nurses who volunteered to give these medications to our patients on Mondays and Thursdays. But because receiving monoclonal antibodies really had to happen within a few days of being diagnosed with COVID, I would be making most of my calls to patients on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then over the weekend. So one of the really hard things about this in terms of providing patient care is that you were not reaching out to any patient that you had an actual relationship with. It was often your first contact with that patient. I was a stranger to the people I called. But I felt, at least at the beginning, that I had this armor as a physician and as one who also worked at the same healthcare system where they received care, that this was something that gave me credibility and would make me a trusted voice. Wasn't necessarily the case. So I remember calling one gentleman who was unvaccinated, who was elderly, who was living in a rural area with a lot of comorbidities and a malignancy that he was receiving treatment for, and trying to offer him the treatment and educate him about what an emergency use authorization was so that he could make an informed choice. I thought he was very high risk for suffering complications from COVID-19. And my choice for him would have been for him to receive the medication. And a couple of things struck me. First was how upset he became when I asked him if he was vaccinated. He told me that the vaccine goes into your DNA and that he would not take the vaccine, and he was very angry that I asked the question. Secondly, I was struck by how he just didn't want to know anything about the monoclonal antibodies. He didn't want to have the information in order to make an informed choice for himself. When I asked him if I could just tell him about the medication so that he would have the knowledge to decide at least, he told me no, I could not. And then he further told me that I must be receiving a kickback from the pharmaceutical company, or there was no way I would be calling him on a Sunday night. So among all the vaccine information sessions I've done, all the town halls where I've answered strange questions, all the press interviews I've done, all the conversations I've had about all kinds of medications, I think this is the one that really sticks with me from the pandemic on this subject of trust, which is the fact that a patient, when called by a physician from a nonprofit hospital where they are receiving all their usual care, is so suspicious that they imagine that the only reason a doctor would contact them on a Sunday night is so that they can make a buck at their expense. It's very, very difficult to combat medical misinformation if trust is not there. I think, there are three things that contribute to trust within a society. People feeling like they have social capital, which isn't always the case nowadays. People feeling that their institutions are strong and that they trust them. That's not the case these days. And then the society having shared stories that they all believe in together, which is also not the case these days. Edelman is a company that does a trust barometer predominantly for the business world. Their number one finding in 2022 was that distrust is now society's default emotion. Nearly 6 in 10 people that they surveyed in 2022 say that their default tendency is to distrust something unless they see evidence that it is trustworthy. I think when distrust is the default, we lack the ability to debate or to collaborate, even to collaborate with our patients to make their health better. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stiefel. Compelling. Our final speaker will be Dr. Russell Bledsoe, who is Clinical Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Learner College of Medicine, CCLCM we call it. And he's going to address how do we get at this, with educators, as educators in training healthcare professionals who need to then be able to communicate with the broader public. So, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. To all the other panelists, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I was alerted actually on the phone this morning. Interestingly, someone mentioned it's the 4th anniversary. I was alerted for a social media post I had 3 years ago to the day. In my role at that point as a private physician, when the pandemic had just hit, beginning to utilize the social media platform for the education of our patients. And it was literally 3 years ago today. Having done some social media at that point, some local media, print media, radio, etc., through the early days, there was fairly smooth sailing for the most part. We had a lot of difficult issues, as has been elucidated. Our patient population and the general public in those, as you guys remember, the early days were fairly open. However, as things progressed and the events and everything that we've all lived through, therefore ensued, there began to be obviously pushback on not only on social media, but in personal communications. There developed a question of trust, as has been mentioned, between the clinician and patient. And I distinctly became interested in the public health parameters of communication itself, especially in the platform of social media. And as was mentioned also by another panelist, the World Health Organization termed this an infodemic early. And some commentators and some of the statistics would indicate that perhaps the disinformation or misinformation has been perhaps as severe in causing mortality as the virus itself, which is sobering to think about and striking. And having had similar patient experiences, literally people dying at home because the virus wasn't real, people leaving the hospital because the virus wasn't real, and subsequently having morbidity or mortality. It really struck a nerve with a lot of us and me personally of how can we combat this on a daily basis, and how can we utilize social media for our own, hopefully, benefit and for the patient's benefit. You guys, we all know social media is not going anywhere. The recent publicity regarding TikTok, et cetera, you guys know this is a ubiquitous issue. And it is my concern that as clinicians, if we cede this field to the powers that be, we're giving up a voice that will be detrimental to our patients and the community at large. The conundrum, I think, is how do we best communicate in this medium and in general? I've had the pleasure over the last year to be involved, almost a year now, to be involved in a collaborative practice effort involving medical students, dental students, nursing students, social work students through CASE. Our actually team leader is here tonight. And the point of our emphasis the last almost year now, academic year, has been how do we develop a curriculum that hopefully can be implemented and studied in a health professions setting, such that psychology, English, writing, et cetera, how do we bring all this in so that as a health educator, as a clinician, as a nurse, as a social worker, one can feel comfortable going onto a social media platform and helping to combat the disinformation. There's a lot of pluses and minuses. There's a lot of pros and cons. We've talked about psychology. We've talked about the threats that a lot of us have faced, personally, which is something we're not used to online. All that factors into how do we best implement this paradigm long term. In my opinion, this is in the early stages across the country. It's something that's kind of on the cutting edge, and it's exciting to be part of something, hopefully, that can help be implemented and help combat this. Some of the governing boards, and I don't speak for all of them, of course, but having some conversation with, for instance, the American Board of Internal Medicine, there's some thought, even from a national perspective, that eventually there may be a seal or a stamp or something that is given out so that perhaps it would help if the general public knew that this physician, this nurse was kind of certified to make statements on social media. That's just an example, I think, of something that may be coming down the pike. And from our perspective, how do we prepare for that? And how do we continue to engage the community from a public health viewpoint? I think the challenge is going to be there. We know pandemic flu 2030, COVID 25, whatever, something else is coming down the pike. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it will be. I think one lesson of the pandemic is how can we be adaptable? But I'm firmly convinced that for all of us involved in health professions, trying to build a curriculum so that we can help combat the disinformation and misinformation is key, involving multiple specialists, multiple social sciences, et cetera. And it's our hope that we can contribute a little bit to that voice or that effort here. And like I said, I've been proud to be part of the collaborative effort. These guys have done a great job. And hopefully that curriculum at CASE actually could be marched out in the next year or two, perhaps as an elective, et cetera, to many health professions. So it's an issue that I feel strongly about. I think we all feel strongly about. We've got to be on the front lines, combating this disinformation, combating the misinformation, regardless of political stripe or bent. We want what's best for our patients, and how best to get that across, especially in a social media world, is something that I think we're all going to wrestle with from this point on. So it's in the infant stages. I think it's a huge issue. And of course, we welcome feedback and discussion, but I appreciate the chance to at least briefly talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bledsoe. So what we want to do now is just open it up to conversation. And I'm sure there are lots of thoughts that are flickering through your neural networks. So we'll open it up, and I'm going to monitor the online. We have one back here. Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Seifel about the use of convalescent plasma, which is an interesting case because there's no company behind it. There's no way for a doctor to make a lot of money by recommending convalescent plasma. It involves antibodies previously made by a patient who was infected, and there's a string of studies going back 100 years showing that antibodies can prevent infection with a virus or at least treat an infection with a virus or a bacterial pathogen. And yet, many hospitals will not use it, and their recommendations, including UH, are to focus on remdesivir and Paxlovid, which are reasonable, but some patients can't take those drugs for whatever reason. And the mantra of evidence-based medicine has been part of the problem, from my perspective, because the early trials, randomized clinical trials, were done poorly by administering a therapeutic that can only be effective early in the viral course, late, or not checking the titer of the antibodies, the amount of antibodies in the blood, which obviously is going to matter. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that topic.
Is that working? Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think the answer is completely clear yet. So the Infectious Diseases Society of America right now has not made a recommendation to use convalescent plasma for most patients who are hospitalized with COVID-19. They have, however, said that the jury is still out on patients who might not make an appropriate immune response after they're infected with COVID-19, patients who are on cancer therapy, who are immunosuppressed, et cetera. And so we definitely need more studies in that regard. There have also been some flaws with some of the studies that have been done, as you've pointed out. Some studies did not use high titer convalescent plasma, which is clearly much more efficacious than, just any convalescent plasma. You want it to have a certain amount of the antibodies that you're interested in. And then I myself was involved in a multi-center VA trial of using convalescent plasma, which unfortunately started to run at exactly the wrong time when the epidemiology went very low, and it ended up closing because of lack of enrollment. So I think for patients who are immunosuppressed, I think it's the jury's still out whether it could be used or not. And if there aren't other options, I think you can still obtain it and use it in that regard.
My question had to do with the fact that overcoming people's beliefs, particularly if they're misinformed beliefs, is just really, really hard to do. And teachers are all trained that, your students come into your classroom with preconceived notions. And for the most part, no matter what you teach them, you're not going to be able to overcome those preconceived notions. So the same thing is true about misinformation and disinformation with COVID. Is a lot of people have formed these beliefs, and now here we're trying to combat something that's sort of embedded in their minds. How do we do that? How do you get them to change when it's, I don't know.
That's a very dystopian view.
So you said that maybe dystopian view that seems accurate. It's almost kind of sadly. As I was approaching this topic, I was really impressed with kind of the strength from which people hold these misinformed beliefs, which many of us would kind of want to combat with facts, right? Facts based on empirical evidence, based on logic, based on clinical trials that are well done, rigorous empirical evidence, kind of overwhelming to the point where you can see that belief is erroneous. But the people who hold these beliefs don't really want to listen to that. So I'm not going to suggest a barrage of facts. What I might suggest would be to kind of piggyback off of the idea about narrative as being more persuasive in these instances. And it's not narratives that would be, I think sometimes people who come from empirical backgrounds are a little bit hesitant to rely on storytelling and narratives because they think it is somewhat disingenuous to do so. But narratives in such a way where you are incorporating the relevant facts, but in such a way to engage emotional processing, where people can actually then have a personal connection to that story and engage with what we think are as the correct facts. I think another thing to add to that, in addition to narrative, is I think it was also touched upon that when people process this information in their daily lives, they're not doing it in such a way where they are encountering it and then really thinking about it. it's really done at a kind of a breakneck speed at which the information is produced. They look at it, decide whether to disregard it or accept it. But empirical studies are actually showing that if you give people time to contemplate misinformation, disinformation, if you give them a 5-minute break after they are actually asked to read an article presenting misinformation, they're less susceptible to believing it. So actually having maybe this is probably unrealistic, but a slower pace of life, maybe just just thinking about adding more contemplation and reflection could be just two, so reflection and then also relying on narrative could be two inroads into making some progress.
Question. So I'd like to congratulate all the panelists for their contributions, each of which brought a different aspect to the problem. My comment was going in the same direction as the lady over there. So I get my primary news from NPR, and many times I ask myself, were you preaching to the choir? And those who should hear the results of your analysis are not there to listen to it. So the question is, two questions. Why does my brain chooses NPR as its primary sources for day-to-day information? And the second has to do with, I think, the gentleman, I didn't get your name, sir. You were proposing solutions to improve communication of facts. And I wonder if you could address that in a little bit more specific details. And also the question is, shouldn't education try to teach people just to have an open mind and ask questions?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I think part of our effort from the communication viewpoint or trying to get a point across is having some basic skills of communication, psychology, writing, et cetera, so that we can promote maybe a message from the viewpoint of knowledge and hopefully truth, but promote it or present it in a way that may be more accessible to some people, that may facilitate some exchange of ideas without fear or retribution on either side. Fear is a big part of the problem on social media at times, especially from so-called experts when they're attacked personally. We've seen that. And part of our efforts, at least at this point, is how do we develop a curriculum so that, as you said, the truth can be presented, but presented in a way that others are receptive to. And I think and I'm not an expert in this, but there's a lot of the writing skills, some of the psychological skills. Somebody mentioned, I think earlier, whether you keep repeating something over and over again. And some studies say that's wrong to do, even if you're trying to debunk it. So it's a conundrum. It's an effort, I think, that's going to require sort of an interdisciplinary approach long term, especially for the health professionals who may not be used to thinking about the parameters and I guess the construct itself of communication sciences. Because, for instance, and just anecdotally, but in my own personal training, very heavily trained, obviously, in basic science, clinical science, et cetera, but did not have a lot of formal training until recently in any of the communication sciences. And I think we've seen across the board, whether it's social media, print media, TV, there's been a problem with public health communication the last 3 years. And I think part of our issue is how do we generally promote that? And unfortunately, the other thing I think an answer, in my opinion, unfortunately or fortunately, one avenue by which to foster trust may simply be an ongoing relational aspect to the person you're trying to discuss the factors with. And that's why primary care physicians, pharmacists, trusted, et cetera, people that you go to again and again and again, that may be a key to try to combat this, because it's not just a one-off recommendation, but rather it's an ongoing relationship that hopefully will foster some trust, although we've seen trust fractured even in patients who have long-standing relationships. But I still think the relational aspect of this may be key long-term.
So I have a comment for all of you and a question for Ms. Washington. I talked to you about the antibody, Dr. Avery, referred by my primary care doctor in Metro System. So I had the trust and the relationship that was transferred to you by my own primary care doctor. And I do think education is absolutely key. I think it's remarkable how little people know about their own health. And we do school-based healthcare education in our intergenerational schools, because I think you really have to start early so people don't have all these misconceptions. You have to start early to kind of reverse them. And I do narrative, and I'm a psychologist. So this idea that I have an aphorism, the anecdote is the antidote, because we devalue anecdotes, but powerful stories can be powerful for good or ill, but they can certainly help people make the connections, particularly the emotional ones that are necessary. But here's my most challenging question. I'm looking you in the middle there. So I work on Alzheimer's. I have another comment. We have had so many breakthroughs in Alzheimer's disease that it's broken down. In other words, from your perspective outside the academic institutions, what could we do about not overselling purely medical approaches, creating expectations about cures, telling stories that reinforce the pharmaceutical industry's stories? And I think they're better at telling stories than they are at making drugs in many ways, that, we're just a step away from our next NIH grant away from these magnificent breakthroughs that we're all hoping for. So do we create ourselves a model of health and a model of how we make progress that just ignore some of the main factors that affect the health of our community? So what comments do you have for any dean that's present here today?
Well, I just wrote a story about Alzheimer's, so that's interesting. I think maybe we are guilty in the press of overselling cures. We write a lot of stories about things that are in trials, and you have to say up front, this is bringing hope to families who have this problem, or hope to people. That's just kind of the way those stories get written. So you're probably right. We probably need to dial back on that. But in terms of writing what just comes from the pharmaceutical companies, I mean, that's one perspective, but as a journalist, we're tasked with getting a lot of different perspectives and not just the pharmaceutical company, although you're right, they are good at those narratives and everything. But we try to get a lot of different perspectives in there. And also when I write stories, I try to temper that with, this is in trial. It's going to take so many years before this is actually ready for your doctor to prescribe to you. Try to give a little bit of temperance in there that's not going to be there tomorrow. I hope that answers your question.
It does, but my accusation my claim was that the academic health center actually echoed too much the pharmaceutical. I'm sorry. I apologize. I was just taken away. I wanted to apologize if I misled you. I don't think it's the press that tells the pharmaceutical stories. I think to a certain extent, it's the medical industrial complex. And I don't think there's any question that to your initial comment about the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, it's very powerful on American medicine. That I think is part of the story that we need to kind of think ourselves about how much we promote the same kind of story. So sorry, it wasn't intended a criticism of me.
No.
Thank you.
I was going to say, Dr. Lamb, would you like to comment a little on that? Because I think, did I just throw you a curveball? I think I did. I'm sorry. But I mean, I know that you've done a lot of thinking about this as well, in some ways, in terms of like different ways of knowing and experiencing. Maybe you can retract if you want.
I'm not sure that I have a follow-up exactly for this comment, so I will go ahead and pass for the moment.
Okay. All right.
I am old enough, as are one or two others in the room, to remember when the doctor was always right and the policeman was your friend. Unfortunately, I have lived long enough to witness the debunking of Dr. Oz. What do we do with the confluence of those two dynamics? We've lost, I think all of us can agree, the general trust of some part of the public, and not a small part in my view. What do we do institutionally and or professionally as a profession to try to regain a little bit of the past tense?
I can start a little bit with that. One of the things that I did during the pandemic as a subject matter expert for my entire healthcare system was to deliberately remove the barriers that I usually have between me, what I do personally, and what I tell people. So when I would do presentations about vaccines for town halls, for nurses on different wards, I would tell them that I got the vaccine. I would show them a picture of myself getting the vaccine. When my daughter entered the Pfizer trial and was randomized, she ended up getting a placebo. I showed a picture of my daughter getting an injection. I tried to show people that I was walking the walk and that I was not telling them to do something that I wouldn't do myself or that I wasn't going to have my children do. And I think that helped engage people within my system as a trusted voice. So I think these things are hard to do. You're usually, setting yourself, this is my professional space. I'm going to talk about your health. I'm not going to talk at all about my health. But I found that it helped to engender trust when I shared a little bit more about myself.
I can maybe add two things to that. So one to say, I think that trust in medicine used to be a sort of more monolithic thing. Medicine knows best, right? This is before we hit all the challenges to paternalism. I don't think we need to sell that medicine is the expert. I think we can sell that our doctors have worked very, very hard, right? And have learned a great deal of information, but that the patient too has their own expertise, right? And that it's in the communication between that. We can sell a different kind of trust and expertise, right? One that's based on acknowledging that patients too bring important things into the medical context. I think another key part of trust is that, medicine needs to mirror the world around us, right? So we need more diverse physicians all through the pipeline. Because if medicine remains largely white, largely male, largely upper class, that's not going to contribute, I think, to trust on a large scale.
As a follow-up, every day I receive on my internet email, and I deliberately don't unsubscribe because I find it to be impelling and phenomenally interesting. Emails from a certain Dr. G, who is debunking in each installment medicine and why we should buy his or his partners or his partner's special medication or not medication. I take that back. Can't be medication because it's not FDA approved, even though it will cure any particular ailment that you have. Why aren't we as a profession doing more to combat this kind of licentious activity?
Yeah, you left everybody, dumbfounded.
So I'm just briefly, I'm not sure if that's a good question. I know, like I mentioned briefly, I know, and not speaking for them, but I know the ABIM, Dr. Baer and others have come out. There was a New England Journal commentary by him, I think 6 months ago. I think some of the boards are beginning to look at this, and is there going to be sanctions from a board perspective on some people who are way outside the limits? And that's to say, not that we may disagree on how to manage pneumonia, one antibiotic versus another, but if one of us thinks pneumonia is made up and from Mars, then that's just way outside the sort of the parameters. Now we can talk about how to define the parameters, but I do think some of the national boards are going to start looking at this as far as if we have some actors who are way outside, and that may not be the whole answer, but that may be a start about trying to combat some of this stuff that just is way outside the standard parameters of what we would consider, standard allopathic or osteopathic even medicine. So I don't have an easy answer for that, but I knew some of the boards are beginning to look at that, I think.
I don't remember the specifics, but I can remember hearing stories about, I think, a doctor and a nurse who were sanctioned for making very egregiously erroneous statements during the pandemic. So I think that is being looked at.
I just also read when I was preparing for this that the Association for the Advancement of Science has formed this coalition to look at medical misinformation. And I hope that what you bring up would be one of the things that they would look at, and developing a process of how to deal with disinformation, I guess I would say, from what you're describing.
So I wanted to actually provide a slight twist to this gentleman's first question. He mentioned about the past where everyone, I guess, loved the police and loved doctors. I think that depends on the community you live, right? And so I struggle with, as a physician, talking to many of my friends who are, Black and have multiple degrees, but still have this embedded distrust, and they wouldn't, get the vaccine. I think, and I would like to hear from you, I think more is needed to overcome that mistrust than just education. And I would like to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess my first thought is, what's more than education? I mean, we have to educate people. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did do a story on distrust in the African American community. I had known about Tuskegee. I didn't know the details. I was sickened when I learned all the details. It's just mind blowing. I challenge all of you to go back and read what actually happened. It's really sickening. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you're obviously an African American doctor. I think it's for us African Americans who, in your profession, my profession, to do what we can, but you can only do so much, because, as other panelists have said, if people have that mindset, they don't. But I know what you mean. I mean, I'm thinking back on my past, and there wasn't a whole lot of going to the doctor. My mom, who grew up in Mississippi, had lots of stories about kind of folk remedies and things that she had grown up with. So it's difficult, but I think it's something that we have to keep working at.
I had a question. It's kind of based on the comment made earlier about how a lot of us are, preaching to the choir, like NPR. The people who have the information are listening to the information again, but it's not reaching the people who don't have it, who probably need it. And how do you see, like, mentioned, like, the power of narrative, reaching out to people on social media as educators, but also as individuals. How do you see, like, what do you see as the best way into those, like, rural communities where there's like little enclave of disinformation or misinformation?
Well, I guess I'll start because I still have the microphone. I guess this was a small gesture, but I do post all of my stories on Twitter and some of them on Facebook. So at least it's going out there trying to combat the misinformation. You can click on my story and get good information, and it is on social media.
I wish I had like a really great answer. This would be the time to pull out the great answer. But I think it comes down in many ways to community, which is something that has been challenged in lots of ways through COVID, through the other ways that we connect on social media, et cetera. But there's something about bringing people together. I'll say, before I worked at Case, I worked at Hiram College. I still live in Hiram. This is a small rural town, village in Northeast Ohio. And the power of events there, like to open up to the community. We had a death cafe when I was teaching a course on death and dying, and invited everybody in for dinner at the dining hall and to talk about death experiences, advanced directives, whatever, students seating conversations. That was pretty incredible. Community is something that is really, really challenging, particularly challenging when we are here in the middle of in an urban campus, surrounded by such varied neighborhoods, and what are we doing to create that? But I think community is something that we need to try to nourish more following COVID. I'm not exactly sure how, but I think that's important. Maybe you have the answer.
No, I do not have the answer, but I do have another thought that came to me while listening to your excellent answer. I think part of the solution is more science education, not just in STEM, but in biology, because I think the problem that we had during this pandemic is that so many people did not know how vaccines worked. They did not know what DNA or RNA was. So when you told them it was a mRNA vaccine, they freaked. They didn't know about the scientific method or how science works. So when Dr. Fauci said one thing, and then a few weeks later, he reversed himself. Oh, well, see, he's lying. You know, they're changing their mind. They're going to change their minds again. Well, yeah, because that's how it works. And so I think there was just so much. We were trying to educate people, but it's hard to educate people when they don't have that basis, you know, to work from. So I don't know. I think to be ready for the next pandemic, we need to teach people how these things work so they understand better.
Yes.
So I was just going to say exactly what you just said in the science education part. So in talking with mostly graduate students in my world, that remind them that that we're used to you thinking along one way, and you come in and you do a new experiment, and then now you're thinking you were going here, now you're here. And that's exactly what you were saying that Dr. Fauci would say here. No, where are we here? So when people aren't used to how science works, they didn't see a small pivot. They saw, so that meant all of this is nonsense. And so now we're doing this. In reality, it was just a little pivot because we have more information and that's how we do it. So I think we need to get you, as scientists, we're dealing with people all the time who are thinking like we are. The challenge is going out to the stories to talk to people in a way that this is how it works. And no, it doesn't mean we throw out everything. It's just a little different. But some of my friends who are highly educated, not scientists, they still don't get it. And not that it's not a falsehood or anything. They're just like, how does this work?
And I'll just say, I think this is about investment in education at very, very early levels. Like if we want a more diverse crop of medical students, we need to start that way early on so they get all the experiences that they need, right, to then get into medical school.
I agree about the education. I think it's also education about how we look at the news and what we treat as facts and other facts. But then I wanted to build on what he was just saying about understanding how science works. I think we also have to communicate it better. We have to be clearer about what we know is a fact and what is our theory right now. And this is our best thing. I think that also led to confusion in the public and how things were communicated early on. We mass, no max, but there were reasons behind it, and we understand the reasons. But I think that if as we're communicating things, because I'm sure there will be another pandemic, that we need to be clear about what we know for sure, and this is what we're working. Our working theory is now, and more to come. So,
Excellent.
I'm afraid to state that the whole situation concept is much more maybe, what's the best word, discouraging than we think it is, and may have to do less with education at times. Think about families with multiple SIPs, regardless of whether they are, the discussion at the dinner table is the same for all the SIPs. And yet you have profound differences among the SIPs in their political views, in their views to how they interpret facts. And so the education background, the way they were brought up is very similar. So maybe brain wiring might play a role too.
Well, I know we're coming close. I don't know if there's another comment. Great. One other thing I want to put a plug into is for relationships. And I think that was spoken, and I think that's building the trust. So it's communication, relationships, and science education.
Thank you. Kind of based on like what we were saying, like on the same, I think we had an earlier conversation about tribalism and sort of like bridging those gaps. How do you see the best way? Like, let's say like you're going out to, I'm from Springfield, Ohio, which is like sort of semi-rural, right? So how would you go to a group of farmers in Springfield and present this information? Like, how do you meet them where they're at? They're not going to understand, germ theory or DNA necessarily, depending on their education level. But how do you reach them and say, this is important? Obviously you have some experience, I'm guessing.
I mean, I think what you said yourself is exactly right, is that you need to meet people where they are, both mentally and geographically. So, I think you brought up how do you talk to people who have had adverse experiences in the healthcare system? Maybe their parents or their grandparents had these adverse experiences and they have a fundamental mistrust of things that are happening. And I think active listening and meeting them where they are, understanding their concerns. I have to say, I learned a lot of new concerns during this pandemic. I learned stories that I had never heard before. I learned about people who worked at my hospital who had family members who were part of the Tuskegee experiment, and I had never known that. And then the other thing is, like you say, going out to the community, go out to a state fair, go out to a church, find a trusted voice. If you can find, pastors or community leaders who are willing to hear about the science and believe in it, and they're the trusted voice who could maybe bring the rest of their community with them. I think Better Health Greater Cleveland tries to do a lot of that. And, I think our academic community as a whole could be much better than that, much better than we are in terms of doing that for our surrounding communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think one thing the media could have done better is emphasizing that this is not the flu. And that was the main piece of disinformation I heard over and over again. I don't think we did a good enough job of saying this is not the flu. It will kill you quicker than the flu. And I think we should have kept emphasizing that and repeating it over and over again, and we didn't do that. So maybe under your scenario, that's what the message I would give. This is not the flu. It is more transmissible, or say it spreads more, so you're not using a big word that maybe some people don't know what it means. And that's more likely to kill you than the flu, and you need to get protected, and this is the best way to do it.
I just wanted to add to your comment, Doctor, about finding trusted individuals within a community. And I think that's very important. You might hear on people talk slang and say street cred, right? And we as doctors, we don't have that. And so I think it's important for us to partner with people who have credibility within the community leaders, and, then bring your talking points down to, third grade, fifth grade level. We can do that. And that maybe we can make a change then.
Excellent. I'm going to go there, and then I think I'll let the dean have the last word.
Right up against it here.
One other point that I think is important to add is that oftentimes as physicians, as a future physician, I think we only talk to people when we need something from them, when we are calling them to tell them that we really want them to be in this clinical trial, or we're calling them to, ask them to take these antibodies, and we're maybe not calling them to ask them how they're doing or what they need from us. And I think that building trust needs to happen when we're not in a crisis. Building trust needs to happen when things are going okay. And it's important to help generate that trust by not just kind of swooping in when things are going bad or when you need something from the community. Community participatory research is a good maybe guidepost for that. But I think one way we can really build genuine trust is asking people what they need from us rather than telling people what we need from them.
So, Dean Gerson, you're going to get the last word here.
Well, I have some comments. I'm not sure it's the last word, but I have some comments. So first, I've been brewing the schema concept, which I think is actually really helpful. In my own world, I think of it as people's world's view. You know, that really comes in with a sort of sense of the world, and that's where they're framed from. And so I'm struck by the need to think through our concept of education, not as telling, but infiltrating into the worldview and into the schema. Because I think what you were getting at in the schema was you got to nudge that schema so it's accommodating for new information. And if it just comes from your angle of your scheme, it ain't going to ever work. So I think I heard that. On the comment of navigating information flow, I happen to have a small clinic. I have 2 African-American senior pastors in my clinic. I'm oncologist, so you can I can tell you that they've lived for a long time, thank goodness. One of whom wrote an editorial in the Plain Dealer probably now 2 years ago. So just as the vaccine was coming out. And they both got vaccinated very quickly. And we had many conversations over the last 3 years about how hard it's been in their storytelling. They tell stories better than any of us do, to navigate their congregation towards vaccination. They're the best in the world, frankly, in the community at risk, and they struggled. So I think this is a universal issue. So I've found the conversation to be very helpful, and hopefully we've all learned something. Oh, we get to keep talking outside. Is there something's out there for us? Okay. All right.
And a final thank you for our panelists.